If you grew up in a Canadian household with a woodshed, there's a fair chance there's still a Welland Vale axe in it somewhere. A black prince or a lion, the head heavy in your grandfather's hand, the hickory handle worn smooth by decades of splitting kindling on cold November mornings. At its peak, the works in St. Catharines was the largest axe maker in the country, supplying the BC Forest Service, the CNR, the Department of Highways, and the lumber camps of 3 time zones. They survived 3 catastrophic fires, survived a depression, survived 2 world wars and prohibition, survived the bicycle boom, survived everything the 20th century threw at them for 96 years. And then, after 96 years of forging on the 12-mile creek, the trip hammer fell silent for the last time. How does a name that was in every Canadian woodshed simply disappear? What happened? Chapter 1. The Vale. The story begins with water, not a river, a creek. The 12-mile creek, running north toward Lake Ontario through what would become St. Catharines, Ontario, dropping 2.5 meters over a stretch of rapids that the early settlers called Welland Vale. In 1816, a young Loyalist mill owner named William Hamilton Merritt bought a rundown sawmill at that vale. The water was unreliable, too low in summer, frozen in winter, and Merritt spent years trying to fix it. His solution was to dig a canal that would borrow water from the Welland River and feed it into the 12-mile creek. The first Welland Canal opened in 1829, and Canada had its first link between the lakes. By Confederation in 1867, the canal town that had grown up around Merritt's mill was an industrial place in full bloom. Shipyards lined Port Dalhousie. Grist mills clustered along the creek. The second Welland Canal ran straight through the heart of the city, carrying schooners and steamers between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. The third Welland Canal was already under construction. The town had a working waterfront, a militant shipyard workforce. Over 800 men had struck along the Niagara waterfront in 1861, and a commercial elite that knew exactly what to do with 2.5 meters of falling water. But the Vale itself, the original drop on the creek where Merritt's mill had stood, was sitting unused. In the spring of 1868, 3 men looked at it and saw a forge. Their names were E.C. Tuttle, H.H. Date, and W.H. Rodden, a Connecticut toolmaker, a Canadian-born partner, and a Hamilton hardware merchant with a patent for a hay fork. They had no factory yet, no workforce, no contracts. What they had was a piece of land beside the creek, the right to take water from the rapids, and an instinct that Canada, 3 years into Confederation, with 1,000 miles of railway ahead of it and a continent of standing timber to clear, needed somebody to make the axes. What they built on that water would, within 6 years, become the largest edge tool factory in the Dominion of Canada. Within 20, it would be exporting axes to Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa. Within 50, its workers would be producing the pitchfork that, in the spring of 1941, would capture a Nazi deputy Führer in a Scottish field. And within a century, it would be gone. Closed in a single decision made in an office building in Cleveland, Ohio, after the first strike in its 96-year history. This is how it began. Chapter 2. 3 Names on a Door. E.C. Tuttle was the man who knew how to forge an axe. He was Connecticut-born and Connecticut-trained, part of a generation of American toolmakers who had grown up inside the workshops of the New England edge tool industry, where the tacit knowledge of how to harden a blade, how to draw a temper, how to grind a bevel that would hold an edge through a season of clearing was passed from one apprentice to the next in workshops that ran on water and rumor, and the muscle memory of men who had done nothing else since they were 12. Tuttle had brought that knowledge with him across the border, the way 1,000 other American craftsmen had brought specific industrial skills to the new Dominion in the years after Confederation. Canada wanted what was in his hands. H.H. Date was the Canadian-born partner. The record is thin on him. Directories, a few advertisements, his name on the door. What is clear is that he was the local. He knew the country. He knew the markets. He knew which hardware wholesaler in Hamilton would carry a hay fork, and which in Montreal would handle a scythe. W.H. Rodden was the third man, also Canadian, also a hardware merchant, but with something the other 2 didn't have: a patent. The rod and fork was his invention, and it would remain in the Welland Vale catalog for the next 60 years. He brought capital. He brought a distribution network. And when the firm of Tuttle, Date and Rodden was incorporated in 1868, his name was the one on the door that the wholesalers recognized. They moved fast. By the following year, the forge on the 12-Mile Creek was rolling out axes, hatchets, scythes, pitchforks, hoes, picks, chisels, rakes, draw knives, and machine knives. They opened a warehouse on Colborne Street in Toronto. They submitted their products to the Provincial Exhibition in the fall of 1870, the most important agricultural and industrial fair in the Dominion, and they came home with 6 first-place awards. They had swept the axe category. They had swept the fork category. They had swept the hoe category. A firm that had not existed 2 years earlier was now Canada's best edge tool maker by the verdict of every judge who picked up its products and tested them. By 1871, they were employing 120 men. The Canadian Dominion Directory of that year placed them in the top 1% of all manufacturers in the country. And then, in March of 1873, they went bankrupt. The problem was that they had built faster than they could finance. The 1870s were a brutal decade for industrial credit. McDonald's government had just collapsed in the Pacific Scandal. International markets were tightening. The long depression that would run until 1879 was already gathering. Tuttle, Date, and Rodden had overextended. They couldn't make payroll. The works went into liquidation, and the bailiff's men came down the lane beside the creek to take inventory of what a 3-year-old industrial powerhouse looked like when its owners couldn't pay the bills. This is the moment a second-generation St. Catharines merchant entered the story. William J. Chaplin was not a forgeman. He was a businessman of the kind that 19th-century Canada produced in some quantity, conservative-leaning, politically networked, with a nose for the distressed asset and the patience to wait for the tariff weather to turn. He partnered with another local businessman named Edward C. Jones, and together they walked into the liquidator's office in 1874 and bought the works. They reincorporated it as the Welland Vale Manufacturing Company. They kept the name of the place. They kept most of the workforce. They kept the patterns and the dies and the half-finished stock. What they changed was the management. Jones, after that, disappears almost entirely from the record. The Chaplin name takes over, and it takes over completely. William's son, James Du Chaplin, born in Toronto on the 20th of March, 1863, 6 years before the factory itself existed, would inherit the business, run it for the better part of 40 years, sit 4 years on the St. Catharines City Council, win the federal riding of Lincoln in the 1917 wartime election under Robert Borden's Unionist banner, and serve as the Conservative MP for Lincoln County until 1935. The St. Catharines Museum's surviving file on J.D. Chaplin describes him as a tall, athletic man, a lacrosse player in his youth, and a no-nonsense businessman in his maturity. He married Edna Burgess. He raised his son Gordon, who would also become a Conservative MP. He rose before dawn to feed his hens. He grew red geraniums in his conservatory on Sunday afternoons. He was, in every recognizable particular, a Canadian conservative industrialist of the long late Victorian afterglow, the kind of man who understood that the difference between making axes and making money from axes was the same as the difference between forging the blade and selling it. His father had bought a bankrupt workshop on the 12-Mile Creek. He would turn it into an empire. He had one piece of luck on his side. In March of 1879, 5 years after the Chaplin family had taken over, John A. Macdonald, back in office, enacted the national policy. The Canadian average weighted tariff went from 14% to 21%. The American axe makers who had been selling into Canada under reciprocity-era terms now found themselves selling over a tariff wall. The wall had been built around the Welland Vale Forge, just in time. Chapter 3. Under the National Policy. By 1874, even before the tariff wall went up, Welland Vale was already Canada's largest axe maker. That position would hold for the next 56 years. The signature product appeared in the records by 1876, the Black Prince, a premium single-bit chopping axe whose name would become, for several generations of Canadian woodsmen, the standard against which every other axe was measured. The all-steel premium axe was added in 1886. The 1923 Stark-Seybold of Montreal catalog would describe it as double refined crucible steel, full polished and deep etched, tempered to the highest degree of perfection. The Lion brand, the mid-tier workhorse, would join the line in 1911. By the early 20th century, the catalog would include over 200 distinct brand labels, sold under names like Forest King, Sunset, Royal Oak, Premier, Staghead, Caribou, and Signal, along with a host of contracted private labels, Howland, Owl, produced for hardware wholesalers across the country. This was J.D. Chaplin's first great insight. The same axe head, hardened and ground at the Welland Vale forge, could be stamped with whatever label the customer's distributor required. A farmer in Saskatchewan buying an axe at the local hardware store under one brand was almost certainly buying a Welland Vale. A lumberjack in northern Ontario buying a different brand at a different store was almost certainly buying the same axe, made by the same hands, ground on the same sandstone wheels. The Chaplins understood that brand multiplication was not a betrayal of quality. It was a method of distribution. The factory expanded outward as well as upward. In 1892, J.D. Chaplin founded the Canada Axe and Harvest Tool Company in Montreal, a Quebec subsidiary that would operate semi-independently for nearly 70 years and serve the markets where the Welland Vale name had less reach. In 1895, he acquired the Bedford Manufacturing Company in Bedford, Quebec. He picked up the Canadian Shovel and Tool Company, the Maple Leaf Harvest Tool Company, and a hickory handle works at Turnerday, near Strathroy, that would supply the Welland Vale forge with the seasoned ash and hickory it needed to put a handle on every axe head that came off the line. He served as president of the Chaplin Wheel Company. He sat on the board of the Chaplin Saw Works. He held a stake in a company called Wallingford Manufacturing. By 1900, the Chaplin name appeared on letterhead across an industrial network that ran from the 12-Mile Creek to Montreal and back through Quebec's eastern townships. The first signature catastrophe arrived in 1877. A fire broke out in the works. The source has not been preserved in any surviving record, and devastated substantial portions of the factory. Chaplin rebuilt. It was the first of 3 rebuilds. It would not be the last. By the late 1880s, the Welland Vale site had taken on the shape it would hold for the next 8 decades. The forge shop, with its coal-fired heating hearths, and the trip hammers that struck the red-hot bar steel with a rhythm that could be felt 3 streets away. The grinding shops, where the great sandstone wheels turned constantly underwater, their surfaces dressed each morning by men whose hands no longer felt the grit. The heat treatment area, with its oil quench tanks where the just-forged axe head went from a glowing yellow to a deep black in a single hiss of vaporized oil. The polishing room, the etching room, where the Welland Vale stamp and the brand name and the weight were burnt into the steel. The handle storage warehouse, with hickory and ash from Strathroy stacked in tiers from floor to rafter. The shipping room, opening onto the canal that ran past the factory wall and carrying axes by the crate to Toronto and Montreal, and points farther. The power came from the creek, the 1820s water rights that William Hamilton Merritt had once used to turn a grist mill now turned a forge. The 2.5-meter head of fast water was supplemented by steam. By 1890, most of the major operations were running on a hybrid system that kept the works moving even when winter froze the creek solid. The workforce was British, Canadian, and Irish in the founding generation, with a smaller French-Canadian component on the floor and a small German-Canadian presence in the skilled trades. Sons followed fathers. Brothers worked beside brothers. The forge was a place where you walked in at 14 as a sweeper and walked out at 65 as a head striker, and where a man's reputation for the quality of his heat treatment was known to every hardware merchant from Halifax to Vancouver, who carried a Welland Vale axe with a private label on it. And then, in the middle of the 1890s, J.D. Chaplin made the decision that would briefly turn his axe factory into Canada's largest bicycle factory. The safety bicycle craze had arrived in North America. Pneumatic tires, chain drives, the new affordability of mass-produced steel components. The bicycle was the consumer product of the moment, and the Welland Vale Works had the forging capacity, the sheet steel skills, and the workforce to enter the market at scale. Beginning around 1895, much of the plant was converted. The Welland Vale bicycle lines included three main brands: the Perfect, the Garden City, and the Dominion, plus a popular chainless model. By 1899, the factory employed close to 500 workers, more than 4 times its 1871 headcount, and the bicycle works was outpacing the axe forge in sales volume. In September of 1899, Chaplin folded the Welland Vale Bicycle Works into a new amalgamation called the Canada Cycle and Motor Company, CCM, engineered by Walter Massey of Massey Harris as a defensive consolidation against the American Bicycle Trust, then preparing to invade Canada. CCM brought together 5 major Canadian bicycle makers under one corporate roof. According to the Canada Science and Technology Museum, the new company accounted for 85% of all Canadian bicycle production. For a few months in late 1899 and early 1900, the St. Catharines plant was CCM's busiest factory. On the 16th of May, 1900, it burned to the ground. The fire was the second of 3. The St. Catharines Standard called it the most disastrous conflagration that had occurred in the history of the city. $500,000 in damage, 500 employees out of work, the bicycle building, the remaining edge tool shops, the Chaplin saw works, all of it taken in a single night. And then CCM made a decision that would, in miniature, foreshadow the decision an American corporation would make 65 years later. The bicycle works would not be rebuilt in St. Catharines. The general manager of CCM, Joseph Shenstone, had negotiated a tax-exempt arrangement with the city of Brantford. The full bicycle operation would move there. The St. Catharines Board of Trade howled. The city's working population watched as a head office 100 miles away made a calculation about where production ought to happen, and the calculation went elsewhere. J.D. Chaplin, though, was a different kind of corporate parent. He was Canadian. He owned the land. He owned the water rights. He rebuilt, not bicycles, but edge tools, and by 1903, Welland Vale was once again the largest edge tool producer in the Dominion. The axe era resumed. The bicycle era was finished. But the lesson of 1900 sat on a shelf in St. Catharines for 2 more generations, waiting for someone else to learn it. Chapter 4. Inside the Forge. A man arriving at the Welland Vale gate for the morning shift in January of 1928 would feel the cold first. He would have walked from his house on Russell Avenue or Salina Street, or down off the escarpment from one of the brick rows that the canal had once been built to feed. The 12-mile creek would be frozen at the bridge. The wind, coming down off Lake Ontario, would have driven the wood smoke from every chimney in St. Catharines flat against the rooftops. He would have his lunch in a tin pail. He would have a thermos of coffee. He would have boots that he had been wearing since the war, and a coat that he had been wearing since before it. He would pass the watchman's hut at the Welland Vale Road gate at 6 minutes to 7. The forge was already warm, banked up overnight by the nightman, whose job was to keep the coal in the heating hearths from going cold, because a forge that went cold needed 3 hours to come back to working temperature, and the company didn't pay for 3 hours of waiting. The man would punch in on a card that bore his number. Every worker had one, stamped on a brass tag, and he would walk out onto the floor. The Welland Vale floor was an industrial cathedral built for the making of one thing. It began at the steel rack. Bars of high-carbon crucible steel, imported in part from Sheffield and supplemented after the Great War by Canadian production at Sydney and Hamilton, were stacked by gauge. Thicker bars for double-bit felling axes, thinner for hatchets and broad axes, the heaviest for the heads that the catalog called King, the oversized chopping axes intended for the West Coast forest where a single tree could take a crew 3 days to bring down. The bar would go into the heating hearth, a coal-fired bed brought to a sustained yellow heat, until the steel itself glowed the color of a setting sun. The heater, working with tongs, would feed it to the drop hammer. Here is where you would find the man the surviving photograph from around 1920 calls Ducky Switzer. The picture, held by the St. Catharines Museum, shows him at the trip hammer, forging a king axe head. He is wearing a leather apron over his shirt and a wool cap pushed back on his head. His sleeves are rolled up. The hammer is descending. The steel between hammer and anvil is the color of a candle flame. There is no eye protection. There is no ear protection. There is a half-formed axe head and a man named Switzer, and a hammer that has been striking the same anvil since the 1880s, and the picture has captured a single hundredth of a second in a process that produced, by the careful estimate of period sources, well over 1,000 axes in a single day at peak. The hammer would shape the eye, the hole through which the handle would pass, and rough out the bit. From there, the head would go to the forger's helper, who would hand-finish the geometry on a lighter hammer. Then to the heat treatment shop. Then to the quench. The instant of quenching, the moment a yellow-hot axe head went into oil, was the moment the steel's molecular structure froze into the crystalline form that would hold an edge. A bad quench produced an axe head that was too brittle, or too soft, or warped. A good quench produced something a Canadian lumberjack could swing for 30 years. From quench to the grinder. The grinding shops were the wettest, dirtiest, loudest part of the factory. The sandstone wheels, 3 feet across, 4 feet across, in some cases, turned constantly under a slow drip of water that kept the dust down and the temperature low. The grinder would press the axe head against the stone, working the bevel down by feel, his arms moving in a slow, oscillating arc that he had been making for so many years that his body did it without his attention. The wheel threw a fine mist of water and stone grit and steel particles into the air. Men working in the grinding shops developed lungs that the company doctors of the 1930s would learn to recognize on X-ray, from grinding to polishing, from polishing to the etching shop, where the Welland Vale stamp and the brand name and the axe weight were burnt into the steel with acid through a wax mask. From etching to assembly, where the head was hung onto a handle from the Turner Day handle works. Hickory mostly, ash for the cheaper grades, fitted by a man who had been fitting handles since before the war, and who could feel by the weight of the head and the grain of the wood whether the marriage would hold. By the time the axe reached the shipping room, it had passed through the hands of perhaps a dozen men. Each one had stamped his work with the muscle memory of years. The forge had been running, this morning, since 6. By noon, it would have produced 200 axes. By the 4:30 whistle, it would have produced 400 more. Outside, the temperature would not have risen above -15. The 12-mile creek would still be frozen at the bridge. Inside the forge shop, where Ducky Switzer worked, the temperature would be over 40. The blast from the heating hearth would have raised it above 100 at the workface. The men closest to the hammer would have stripped to their undershirts. The men at the far end of the building, by the loading doors, would still be wearing their coats. The contrast was the daily fact of the work. It was so extreme that the men developed their own system, layers that could be shed and added in seconds. Wool for the walk-in, cotton at the hammer. Nobody taught you this. You learned it or you suffered. At 4:30, the whistle would blow. Ducky Switzer would put down the tongs. The hammer would slow. The men would punch out. The night man would walk in to bank the forge. The next morning, in the dark, another man would walk down off the escarpment with his lunch in a tin pail. The pattern had been the same since 1869, and it would be the same until 1965. This was what it meant to make a black prince. Chapter 5. The Axes of a Nation. By the early 1920s, a Welland Vale axe had become a piece of Canadian infrastructure. The British Columbia Forest Service stamped its axes with its own ownership mark and ordered them by the crate, the Black Prince preferred, the lion accepted as a workhorse for the secondary work. The Ontario Department of Lands and Forests did the same. The Department of Highways Ontario stamped DHO on the poles of axes used by road crews from Cornwall to Kenora. The Canadian National Railway and the Canadian Pacific Railway carried Welland Vale axes in the toolkits of every section gang that maintained the right-of-way from the Maritimes to the Pacific. If you were a man working for a Canadian government, a Canadian railway, or a Canadian resource company in the years between the wars, the axe in your hand had almost certainly been forged on the 12-Mile Creek. It traveled farther than that. The 1923 H.S. Howland Sons and Company catalog listed Welland Vale axes for export to Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and the Caribbean. The all-steel was available in polished, blued, or bronzed finishes, with optional double-bit etching. Alan Klenman's 1990 History of North American Axe Makers credits Welland Vale with exports across the British Empire, a claim the period press took as obvious and the modern researcher takes as plausible, supported by the surviving catalogs, even if the precise tonnage has not been preserved. Inside Canada, the principal competition came from Hull, Quebec, directly across the river from Ottawa, on the Quebec side of the boundary, where the Walters Axe Company had been making axes since 1855. The Walters family were Sheffield-trained cutlers who had taken over the old Hull axe factory that Sexton Washburn had founded on Chaudiere Island in the lumber boom of the 1860s. Under Morley Walters, who ran the firm from the 1920s until the 1960s, Walters Axe produced at peak around 1,000 axes a day. Welland Vale, with a larger workforce and a broader product mix, was producing more. The two firms divided the Canadian market between them through the entire interwar period, with smaller competitors: Campbell Brothers in St. John, James Smart, manufacturing in Brockville, picking up regional niches. The workforce on the Welland Vale floor in 1928 numbered between 400 and 500 men. The British and Canadian founding stock was now joined by a steady drift of new arrivals. The St. Catharines Museum holds a group photograph from this era that catches it well. The image is a standard industrial portrait: 3 rows of men in front of the factory wall, the back row standing, the middle row kneeling, the front row seated on the dirt. One of the standing men, 12th from the right, is marked with an X in the museum's archival caption. His name is Edgar Fielder. He arrived in St. Catharines from England in 1922. He had a trade. He had a wife. He had children he would raise within walking distance of the gate. Edgar Fielder was one of dozens. The post-war British and Irish immigration to the Niagara Peninsula brought Welland Vale a generation of skilled men who had learned their crafts in the workshops of Birmingham, Sheffield, and the Black Country before the Great War. They knew forge work. They knew grinding. They knew the rhythms of an industrial shop that had been running on the same patterns for generations. They walked into a Canadian forge in the middle of a Canadian winter, and they were home. In the years after the Second World War, the workforce would diversify further. Italian, Polish, Ukrainian, and Hungarian workers, drawn primarily to the GM McKinnon Industries plant on Ontario Street, would feed into Welland Vale as well. By the early 1950s, the forge floor was a polyglot place: English, Polish, Italian, French, the occasional Ukrainian, held together by the universal language of the trip hammer and the sandstone wheel. The town that Welland Vale fed was a town of brick rows and chimney smoke, and an Anglican church on a hill, and a Presbyterian church on the next one. The Welland House Hotel on St. Paul Street served as the commercial center. The Lincoln County Courthouse anchored the civic one, the factories that ringed the city: McKinnon Industries on Ontario Street, Hayes Dana on the lakeside, English Electric, Foster Wheeler, Atlas Steel up the QEW at Welland, provided the rest of the industrial weight. By 1945, St. Catharines was an industrial city of 40,000 people. McKinnon Industries alone employed 4,200. Welland Vale's 400 or 500 was a smaller share than it had been in 1900, but the company had become something else: older, deeper, more entrenched in the city's memory. It was the city's first major industry. It was the one that had survived the longest. It had also become, by 1930, something it had not been before. In that year, J.D. Chaplin, by then 67 years old, with 35 years of running the works and the federal seat for Lincoln County still in his pocket, sold every Canadian holding he had built: the Welland Vale Manufacturing Company itself, the Canada Axe and Harvest Tool Company in Montreal, the Bedford Manufacturing Company, the Maple Leaf Harvest Tool Company, the Canadian Shovel and Tool Company, the Turner Day Handle Works at Strathroy. All of it went, in a single transaction, to the American Fork and Hoe Company of Cleveland, Ohio. American Fork and Hoe, headquartered at 1623 Euclid Avenue in the Keith Building, was a Cleveland firm that had been consolidating American axe production for 2 decades. In the same period, it bought Chaplin's Canadian network, It also acquired the Kelly Axe Manufacturing Company of Charleston, West Virginia, the largest American axe maker. With both transactions complete, the American Fork and Hoe Company controlled almost the entire North American axe industry from a single office building in downtown Cleveland. For now, in St. Catharines, almost nothing changed. The new American owner kept the Welland Vale Manufacturing Company name, kept the Welland Vale stamp on the axes, kept the workforce, kept the brands. The Canadian operation continued to run as a Canadian-named subsidiary of a Cleveland parent. J.D. Chaplin retired to his hens and his red geraniums. He served his last term as MP from 1930 to 1935. He died in 1937, having lived to see his factory rebuild itself one last time from a fire that would, in 1936, take it down again. The third fire arrived in the middle of the decade. The factory came back. The building that the third rebuild produced, the brick forge shop that still stands at 59 Welland Vale Road today, was the building the Canadian Army would convert to military production 3 years later, when the Second War came. This was the high country. The Welland Vale axe, by the late 1930s, was the axe a Canadian assumed he would buy. It was the axe his father had owned. It was the axe his grandfather had owned. It was the axe his son would inherit. The company had been running for 70 years. It had survived 2 fires, a depression, prohibition, a continental war, and the loss of its founding family. It had one more peak left. Chapter 6. The Pitchfork in the Field. The Second World War turned every factory in St. Catharines into a war plant, and Welland Vale was no exception. The forge converted to military production almost overnight. Axes for the Canadian Army, entrenching tools for the engineers, picks for the artillery, shovels for every infantryman who would carry one onto the beach at Juneau, broad hatchets for the field engineering units, hay forks for the supply trains. The orders came in from Ottawa, and the trip hammers ran a third shift to fill them. One of those hay forks, in the spring of 1941, ended up in a field outside the village of Eaglesham in Renfrewshire, Scotland. On the night of the 10th of May, 1941, a Messerschmitt Bf 110 came down over the Scottish moors. The pilot parachuted out before the crash. A plowman from a nearby farm, a man named David McLean, walked out to see what had landed in his field. He found a German aviator with a hurt ankle, dressed in a Luftwaffe captain's uniform, claiming to be on a peace mission to the Duke of Hamilton. McLean had a pitchfork in his hand. He held the German at the point of it until the local home guard arrived. The German was Rudolf Hess, deputy Führer of Nazi Germany, the man who had been Hitler's second-in-command for the previous decade. The pitchfork had been made in St. Catharines. The story is preserved by the St. Catharines Museum, passed down through Welland Vale's own institutional memory, and confirmed by the period accounts. It is the kind of detail that, in the hindsight of a documentary, seems almost too neat to be true. A Canadian fork in a Scottish field, holding a Nazi at bay. But it happened, and it sat on the company's mantelpiece for the next 25 years as the brightest moment in its institutional history. By 1945, Welland Vale was running at its absolute peak. The orders were strong. The workforce was at 450. The Black Prince, the Lion, the All Steel, the Forest King. Every line in the catalog was selling. The 1946 fire, the third major blaze the factory survived, was a near miss rather than a catastrophe. The rebuild kept the plant in production. The post-war Canadian economy was about to enter its longest boom. In April of that year, the St. Catharines Standard ran a feature on Welland Vale as part of a series on the city's post-war industries. The tone was confident. The factory was praised as one of the foundational industries of the Niagara region. The Welland Vale name was treated as something permanent, as much a part of the local landscape as the canal or the escarpment or the lake. In Cleveland, in 1949, American Fork and Hoe changed its corporate name to the True Temper Corporation. In St. Catharines, in 1950, the Canadian operation was rebranded to match. The Welland Vale Manufacturing Company became, on the letterhead, True Temper. The Black Prince was now the True Temper Black Prince. The Lion was now the True Temper Lion. The stamp on the poles of the axes carried both names through a transitional period, Welland Vale and True Temper, side by side, for roughly the next 6 years. The dual stamp is, today, the most reliable dating marker for collectors of vintage Canadian axes. An axe stamped with both names dates from 1950 to 1956. An axe stamped only True Temper, with no Welland Vale mark, dates from later. The collectors who know this know it because the Welland Vale stamp, by the late 1950s, had become a thing that was disappearing from the steel. The factory at 59 Welland Vale Road did not know it yet. In 1950, J.D. Chaplin had been dead for 13 years. His son Gordon, now a Conservative MP himself, was building his own career in Ottawa. The Chaplin name had left the masthead 20 years earlier. The American owner had kept the Canadian shell intact for 2 decades, had even kept the Welland Vale stamp on the steel. From the outside, nothing had changed, but the corporate weather had. Cleveland, in the early 1950s, was beginning to think about consolidation. The Canadian operation was a long way from the Charleston works. The Canadian market was small. The decisions about what to make, where to make it, and how many people to keep employed making it. Those decisions were no longer being made in St. Catharines. They were being made in an office on Euclid Avenue, in a city across the lake. The forge on the 12-mile creek was running at full capacity. The order book was full. The Black Prince was still the axe a Canadian assumed he would buy. And somewhere, in a development laboratory in British Columbia, the first one-man chainsaws were beginning to find their market. Chapter 7. The Sound from the West. The chainsaw arrived in Canada from a workshop in Burnaby, British Columbia. In 1943, a group of Vancouver engineers and investors had formed a company called Industrial Engineering Limited, IEL, to acquire the Canadian manufacturing rights for the Reed Prentice chainsaw, an American 2-man machine designed for coastal logging. IEL built the saws in a small plant on the Lower Mainland through the late 40s. The market was professional, the machines were heavy, and the axe still owned the woods. That changed in 1951. IEL introduced a one-man saw called the Super Pioneer. It weighed under 30 pounds. A single logger could carry it into a stand of timber, start it alone, and bring down in 20 minutes a tree that would have taken him and a partner most of a morning with a crosscut and an axe. The British Columbia coastal lumber camps converted first. By 1955, the chainsaw had taken over the West Coast. By 1960, the pulpwood operations in northern Ontario and Quebec had followed. By the middle of the decade, the felling axe had been demoted to a tool you kept on the truck for limbing, for brushing, for the moments the chainsaw wouldn't start. It was no longer the primary instrument of Canadian forestry. In 1956, the Wisconsin-based Outboard Marine Corporation bought IEL. 2 years later, it moved the operation to Peterborough, Ontario, and renamed it Pioneer Chainsaws Limited. By the early 60s, Pioneer was the second largest employer in Peterborough. The chainsaw industry had become a Canadian industry. The axe industry was becoming a memory. In St. Catharines, the order book began to thin. It thinned first from the West Coast. The BC Forest Service orders dropped through the late 50s as the chainsaw replaced the crew axe in the cut block. It thinned from the Ontario logging camps. It thinned from the pulp companies. The Black Prince was still bought by woodlot owners, by trappers, by farmers, by the cottage trade, by the railways and the highway crews. But the buyers were no longer ordering by the gross. They were ordering by the dozen. The second force was the disappearance of the small farm. In 1941, Canada had over 730,000 farms. By 1966, that number had fallen below 440. The farms that remained were consolidating, mechanizing, replacing hand tools with tractor-drawn implements. The Welland Vale catalog, scythes, pitchforks, hand-pulled rakes, hoes, sickles, shovels, was a catalog for a Canada that was emptying out. The Massey Harris combine had replaced the man with the scythe. The tractor-mounted hay loader had replaced the man with the fork. The farmer who in 1925 had bought a Welland Vale tool every spring was, by 1955, buying one every 5 years. By 1962, He was buying one whenever the old one finally broke. The third force was the easing of the tariff wall. The 1947 General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade had begun the long, slow softening of the protective barriers that the national policy had thrown up in 1879. By the early 60s, Japanese, German, and Swedish toolmakers were producing at quality and at prices that crossed the Pacific and the Atlantic and the diminishing duty wall without difficulty. The Welland Vale axe was still the best axe a Canadian could buy. It was no longer the cheapest. And the fourth force was the one that sat in an office on Euclid Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio. In the early 1960s, the True Temper Corporation began an aggressive consolidation program. The Encyclopedia of Cleveland History records the moves. The Ashtabula plant closed. The Geneva plant centralized. A new 88-acre, $3.5 million facility built at Saybrook, Ohio. The logic was the logic of every American corporation in that decade. Fewer plants, larger plants, newer plants, all on the American side of the border, all within trucking distance of each other. The St. Catharines Works, from a Cleveland accountant's perspective in 1964, was a problem. The forge building was nearly 30 years old. The site was small, a few acres on a creek in southern Ontario. The Charleston Works in West Virginia, where Kelly Axe had been folded into True Temper, sat on 53 acres and could absorb the Canadian production without expansion. The Canadian market was shrinking under the pressure of chainsaws and consolidating farms. The border between St. Catharines and Charleston, in an era of softening tariffs, was increasingly a line on a map rather than a wall on a balance sheet. The Canada Axe and Harvest Tool Company in Montreal, the Quebec subsidiary J.D. Chaplin had founded in 1892, was the first to go. It closed in 1960. The decision was made in Cleveland. The Montreal workforce was let go. In St. Catharines, the forge kept running. The Black Prince was still being stamped. The Lion was still being shipped. The men on the floor, the older ones who had been there since before the war, the younger ones who had joined in the post-war hiring waves, knew that the orders had thinned. They could see the gaps in the workday. They knew that the night shift had been wound back. What they did not know was that on the 1st of June, 1965, the corporate identity of the Canadian operation would be changed. The new name was True Temper Canada Limited. The Welland Vale name, which had been on the door at 59 Welland Vale Road for 91 years. Through 3 fires, 2 world wars, a depression, a bankruptcy, a bicycle boom, and an American acquisition, was, by a stroke of corporate pen in Cleveland, removed from the masthead. The men on the forge floor read about it in the local paper. The Black Prince stamp on the steel they were forging that summer no longer said where it came from. The town that the factory had been named for now had a factory name for a Cleveland brand. This was the warning sign nobody at the plant was equipped to read. The deletion of the Canadian name was not by itself an announcement of closure. It was a clearing of the books, the elimination of a sentimental Canadian asset from a Cleveland corporate ledger in preparation for a decision that had not yet been made but was now possible to make. 6 months later, the strike began. Chapter 8. The First Strike. The exact date the strike began has not been preserved in any open source available to a researcher in 2026. The St. Catharines Standard microfilm for the second half of 1965 holds the answer. The Library and Archives Canada file on the dispute, kept in the Department of Labor Strikes and Lockouts series, holds the names of the union representatives, the company representatives, the dates of conciliation, the points of disagreement. Both records sit in archives that have not been digitized. What the secondary record establishes is this. At some point in 1965, after the 1st of June, the men of the Welland Vale Forge, for the first time in 96 years of continuous operation, walked off the job. 94 of them. The figure is consistent across every source. 94 men. Not 300. Not the 450 who had been on the payroll in the early 50s. 94. The number itself tells you what had already happened to the workforce. The chainsaw and the consolidating farms and the cheap imports had been eating the order book for 15 years, and the company had been letting the headcount fall through attrition. The forge that had employed 500 in 1899 was down to fewer than 100 when the men finally put down their tongs. The union has not been identified in surviving open sources. The most likely candidate is the United Steelworkers of America, which represented similar Canadian metalworking plants in this period, and was actively organizing the smaller forges and foundries across southern Ontario. It may have been an independent shop union, which would help explain why the first strike came so late in the company's history. Independent unions, in the pattern of the long Canadian industrial peace, tended to settle. Steelworkers locals tended to fight. Whatever the affiliation, the men were not asking for the moon. The grievances that produced first strikes in Canadian forges of this period were standard: wages, shift premiums, seniority rights, layoff protection, the company's right to subcontract. The men knew the orders were thinning. They were trying to secure what was left. They struck. The forge went cold. In Cleveland, the True Temper Corporation now faced a decision. The Encyclopedia of Cleveland History does not preserve the name of the executive who made it. Allegheny Ludlam Steel would not acquire True Temper until 1967, so the man in the chair was a True Temper president from the pre-acquisition era, working from the Euclid Avenue offices. He had access to a balance sheet that showed declining Canadian sales, an aging Canadian plant, a fully capable American sister facility in Charleston, and a striking Canadian workforce of 94 men. He had a choice: negotiate, settle, restart the forge, keep the Canadian operation running, or refuse. Let the strike go. Move the production to Charleston. Close the plant. He chose the second. The decision did not arrive in St. Catharines as a thunderclap. It arrived the way these decisions always arrived: quietly, as a press release, as a memo to the union, as a notice taped to the gate at 59 Welland Vale Road. The company would not be settling. The production of the Black Prince, the Lion, and every other line in the Welland Vale catalog would be transferred to the Kelly Axe Works in Charleston, West Virginia. The St. Catharines plant would close. The strike, which the men had begun as a negotiation, became a closure. There was no settlement to reach. There was no offer to accept. The forge that had been running for 96 years was going to go cold not for a week or a month, but permanently, because an American corporate parent had run the numbers, and the numbers said Charleston. The pattern was the same as 1900, when the Canada Cycle and Motor Company had moved the bicycle works to Brantford after the fire. It was the same as 1960, when the Canada Axe and Harvest Tool Company in Montreal had been wound down by Cleveland. It was the pattern of the Canadian branch plant, played out one more time in a town that had been doing one thing for almost a century and was about to stop. There was no rally. There was no political intervention. The federal MP for the riding was, by then, a Liberal, Joseph O'Keefe, and the closure of a small forge in St. Catharines did not rise to the level of national news. The Globe and Mail of the period covered the dispute briefly. The St. Catharines Standard covered it day by day. The St. Catharines Museum's archival summary records the ending in a single sentence. In less than a year of the corporate rebrand, the famed Welland Vale plant closed, throwing 94 men out of work. In February of 1966, the buildings on Welland Vale Road were sold to the Lincoln County Board of Education. The forge had gone cold. The trip hammer had stopped. The sandstone wheels had been let to dry. The Black Prince and the Lion would now be stamped in West Virginia, with the words "True Temper Kelly" on the pole. The Canadian axes were finished. Chapter 9. The Last Shift. The last shift at 59. Welland Vale Road was a winter shift. The 12-mile creek was frozen at the bridge. The wind, coming down off Lake Ontario, was doing what it had been doing every January since the first forge fire was lit on the site in 1869. The men walking through the gate that morning had walked through the same gate for years. Some of them had walked through it for decades. Some of them had walked through it because their fathers had walked through it. The forge had been banked the night before by a nightman, who, by the standards of every previous night in the plant's history, expected to be banking it again the following night. He would not be. Inside the forge shop, the coal-fired heating hearths came up to temperature one last time. The trip hammers were tested one last time. The sandstone wheels in the grinding shop began to turn. The water dripped onto them the way it had been dripping since the 1880s. The men worked. They had been told what was happening. They had heard it from the union. They had read it in the Standard. They knew the Charleston decision had been made. They knew the order book was being transferred. They knew the buildings had been promised to the Board of Education. They worked anyway. They forged what was on the schedule for the day. The axe heads went from the heating hearth to the drop hammer. The hammer shaped the eye and roughed out the bit. The heads went to the helper. The helper finished the geometry. The heads went to the heat treatment shop. The quench tanks took them and gave them back. The grinders worked the bevels. The polishers polished. The etchers burnt the true temper stamp into the steel. The axes that came off the line on the last day were stamped true temper. The Welland Vale name was not on them. Some of the men had been forging Welland Vale axes for 30 years, some for 40. The grandson of one of the older workers, posting decades later on a public collectors forum, would remember it this way. His grandfather had started at the plant in the late 1930s. He had worked there until it closed in 1965. He had spent his working life on the same floor, beside the same wheels, hearing the same hammer. There was no ceremony. There was no speech from Cleveland. There was no plaque unveiled. There was no last bell rung. The men were not asked to sign the last axe. The last axe went into a crate with the others and was shipped to a hardware wholesaler who had no idea it was the last one. At the end of the afternoon shift, the men punched out. The night man did not come. The forge cooled. It cooled overnight. It cooled into the second day. It cooled through the rest of the week, through the rest of the month, through the rest of the winter. The heating hearths that had been kept warm for 96 years went cold. The sandstone wheels stopped turning. The water that had been dripping onto them ran into the floor and into the drains and into the creek, and there was nothing to grind. By February, the buildings had been sold. The Lincoln County Board of Education took possession. The forge shop became a supplies warehouse. The grinding shops became maintenance bays. The polishing room became storage. The etching shop, where the Welland Vale stamp had been burnt into the steel for nearly a century, became an empty room with a concrete floor. 94 men were out of work. They were, for the most part, middle-aged. They were, for the most part, men whose skills had been formed on a forge floor and could not easily be transferred. They had been heaters, hammermen, grinders, polishers, etchers, fitters. They had spent their working lives perfecting a craft that no longer had a market. Some of them went down the road. The General Motors plant on Ontario Street, the McKinnon Industries operation that GM had bought in 1929, was hiring rapidly in the mid-60s, building toward the peak it would hit in 1969, with nearly 10,000 workers across the two St. Catharines plants. UAW Local 199, the second UAW local ever chartered in Canada, absorbed many of the displaced True Temper Canada workers into the GM workforce. But the forge skills did not translate. A man who had spent 30 years learning how to read the color of yellow-hot steel through the eye of a trip hammer was not, at the GM line, doing what he knew. He was operating a press, or running a drill, or working the powertrain forge under a different kind of supervisor with a different kind of expectation. He had a paycheck. He did not have his craft. Others did not find new work. Men in their late 50s with 30 years of Welland Vale on their record found that the Canadian labor market of 1966 had no place for them. Some retired early. Some lived on what their wives earned. Some left the city. The multi-generational families, the Switzers, the Fielders, the dozens of others whose names are preserved only in St. Catharines Museum photo captions and in the memories of grandchildren posting on collectors' forums, saw the chain break. The son who had been planning to follow his father into the forge would not be following. There was no forge. The Welland Vale Manufacturing Company, the Tuttle Date, and Rodden Works, the True Temper Canada plant, the factory by whatever name, on the same patch of ground beside the 12-mile creek at the original drop where William Hamilton Merritt had built his sawmill in 1816, was finished. It had run for 97 years. Chapter 10. The Brand on the Steel. The Black Prince did not die immediately. The brand survived the closure by 16 years. From 1966 to 1982, axes stamped True Temper Kelly, and in some cases still stamped Black Prince and Lion, were produced at the Charleston Works in West Virginia and sold throughout North America. The Canadian buyers who pulled a Black Prince off the rack at the hardware store in 1972 were buying an axe that had been forged in Charleston, not in St. Catharines. The shape was the same. The grind was approximately the same. The steel was American. On the 28th of May, 1982, the Charleston Works closed. The True Temper Corporation by then had been through its own corporate dismemberment. Allegheny Ludlam Steel of Pittsburgh had acquired the company in 1967. In 1981, it had been split in two, True Temper Hardware and True Temper Sports. The hardware division was moved to Camp Hill, Pennsylvania. The Cleveland offices on Euclid Avenue closed. The Charleston Axe Works, which had absorbed the Welland Vale production in 1966, was wound down by 1982. True Temper Hardware was sold to the Huffy Corporation of Dayton, Ohio. In 1999, Huffy sold True Temper to the AME's Companies, a Massachusetts firm that traced its founding to John Ames in 1774, making it the oldest continuously operating industrial corporation in the United States. The combined company became Ames True Temper. It changed hands again to Windpoint Partners of Chicago in 2002, to Castle Harlan in 2004, and ultimately to Griffin Corporation, which owns the brand today. The Camp Hill plant in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the last major North American production facility for the True Temper line, produced, according to its own corporate filings, 85% of all wheelbarrows sold in the United States and Canada, approximately 1.7 million wheelbarrows a year. In the early 2020s, Griffin announced that production would be moved offshore. According to the Central Penn Business Journal of 2023, the Harrisburg plant closure was a total closure. All employees at the facility would be impacted. There is no True Temper axe made in North America today. The brand exists. It is owned by a New York-listed conglomerate. It is applied mostly to garden tools manufactured in Asia. The Black Prince is not in the current catalog. The Lion is not in the current catalog. The All Steel is not in the current catalog. Walter's Axe in Hull, Quebec. Welland Vale's principal Canadian competitor through the entire interwar period, closed in 1973, 7 years after the St. Catharines plant. The Walters family had run the firm since 1855. Morley Walters, who had presided over its peak in the 1950s, lived to see it shut. He died in 1969. Canadian axe manufacturing, as a meaningful industry, ended in the 1970s. The country that had once been the third largest producer of axes in the English-speaking world, that had exported edge tools to Australia and New Zealand and South Africa and the Caribbean, no longer made axes at any scale. What it had left was the secondary market. The Black Prince and the Lion did not disappear with the factory. They went into Canadian woodsheds, into Canadian cabins, into the back of Canadian pickup trucks, into the toolboxes of the Department of Highways, and the CNR, and the CPR, and the BC Forest Service, and the Ontario Department of Lands and Forests. They sat there. They held their edge. They went on cutting. In the early years of the 21st century, as the men who had bought them new began to die, and their grandchildren began to clear out the woodsheds and the garages and the basements, the Black Prince and the Lion began to surface on the collector's market. A single-bit Black Prince in collector condition, today, sells in the Canadian secondary market for somewhere between $75 and $150. A double-bit, restored, sells for between $200 and $230. The collectors know how to read the stamps. They know that an axe marked with both the Welland Vale name and the True Temper name dates from the transitional period between 1950 and 1956. They know that an axe marked only True Temper, with the weight stamp but no Welland Vale, dates from later, from the years between the rebrand and the closure, or from the Charleston era after the closure. They know that the dual-stamped axes are the most prized because they sit in the seam, halfway between the Canadian past and the American future. The St. Catharines Museum holds a Welland Vale axe head from around 1930. It is mounted in a display in the Isabella Frampton Hawken Gallery, which is devoted to the water-powered industries that grew up along the 12 Mile Creek. The gallery also holds the photograph of Ducky Switzer at the trip hammer. It holds the photograph of Edgar Fielder among the workforce. It holds a CCM bicycle, donated by a St. Catharines resident named George Walker, that was made at the Welland Vale plant during the brief bicycle boom at the end of the 19th century. It holds, in other words, the memory. The thing itself, the factory, the forge, the 450 men, the trip hammers, and the sandstone wheels, and the etching shop where the Welland Vale stamp had been burnt into the steel for 96 years. That is somewhere else. Chapter 11. The Yew Tree. The brick forge building at 59 Welland Vale Road still stands. It is the building put up in the rebuild after the 1936 fire, modified after the near-miss fire of 1946, and largely unchanged in its external structure since the closure in 1966. From 1967 until 1998, it housed the St. Catharines campus of the newly established Niagara College of Applied Arts and Technology, one of the original Bill Davis-era community colleges of Ontario. The forge shop became a welding shop. The grinding bays became machine shops. The men who had been the sons of Welland Vale workers learned trades in the rooms where their fathers had forged axes. In 1998, Niagara College consolidated its operations on a new campus at Glendale Avenue in Niagara-on-the-Lake. The forge building emptied again. It did not stay empty. In 1998, a Canadian pharmaceutical company called BioLize Pharma Corporation moved in. BioLize had been founded in 1980. It was, and remains, the only domestic Canadian manufacturer of paclitaxel-based oncology drugs. Paclitaxel is a chemotherapy compound used in the treatment of breast, ovarian, lung, and pancreatic cancer. It is derived from the bark of the yew tree. Specifically, from Taxus canadensis, the eastern yew, a small evergreen native to the forests of southern Ontario, Quebec, the Maritimes, and the northeastern United States. The BioLize process does not require the yew tree to be felled. The bark can be harvested in a way that allows the tree to live. The company, run by its president Brigitte Keegan, sources its raw material from regulated yew stands across eastern Canada. The factory at 59 Welland Vale Road, which for 96 years had made axes for cutting Canadian trees, now makes cancer drugs from a Canadian tree that does not have to be cut down. The 12-mile creek still runs past the building. It still drops 2.5 meters over the rapids that William Hamilton Merritt bought in 1816. The creek is not frozen for as long now as it used to be. The winters are not as cold. The wind off Lake Ontario still comes down the same way it always has. The forge inside the building is gone. The trip hammers are gone. The sandstone wheels are gone. The heating hearths are gone. The quench tanks are gone. The etching shop is gone. The handle storage warehouse is gone. The shipping room is gone. The brass tags with the workers' numbers are gone. The pictures of Ducky Switzer at the hammer are in a museum across town. What remains is a building, a pharmaceutical clean room, a laboratory, a small staff working under good manufacturing practice protocols, producing chemotherapy compounds in milligram quantities for distribution to Canadian hospitals. The town of St. Catharines, since the Welland Vale closure, has been through several more waves of industrial loss. English Electric closed. Foster Wheeler closed. Hayes Dana closed. Atlas Steel closed. Ferranti Packard closed. The John Deere plant closed. The GM plant on Ontario Street, the McKinnon Industries works that had absorbed many of the Welland Vale men in 1966, closed its main operations in 2010, was partially demolished from 2015 onward, and was abandoned by its developer in 2020. The Niagara region, according to studies of the period, lost approximately 63,000 auto-related and adjacent industrial jobs in the deindustrial waves of the 1980s, the 1990s, and the 2000s. The Welland Vale closure of 1966 was, in this longer arc, the first crack in the dam. It was the smallest of them. 94 men, a single forge, one decision in one Cleveland office. But it was the first. It was the first Canadian factory in St. Catharines to be closed by a foreign parent that had run the numbers and decided the production belonged elsewhere. It was the rehearsal for everything that came after. The Black Prince is still out there. It is in the woodshed of a cottage on Georgian Bay. It is in the back of a pickup truck on a logging road north of Cochrane. It is in the toolkit of a man whose grandfather worked at the Welland Vale plant in the 1940s and who gave him the axe when he turned 16. It is on a shelf in a hardware museum in Vancouver. It is in a private collection in Halifax. It is in the hand of a man splitting firewood on a clear, cold morning in November, somewhere in the Canadian woods, the way a Black Prince had been in someone's hand on a clear, cold morning since 1876. The handle is hickory. The head is high-carbon steel forged on the 12-Mile Creek. The stamp on the pole, if the man holds the axe up to the light, reads either Welland Vale Manufacturing Company, St. Catharines, Ontario, or, on the later models, Welland Vale and True Temper together, the two names overlapping in the brief window when the Canadian past and the American future were both still on the steel. The factory is gone. The forge is gone. The men are gone. The axe is still cutting. The creek is still running. The yew tree, in the forest beyond the city, is still standing.